Great. Well, thank you, everyone, and welcome to the UNC Core Center for Clinical Research Speaker Series. We appreciate you taking the time to join us for our presentation today. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Kerry Costello, who's an assistant professor and director of the AI Biomechanics Lab, which is very cutely abbreviated AIBL, which I was really excited about, in the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering Department at the University of Florida. Kerry is well known to a lot of us. She's trained at Duke, Virginia Tech, BU. She was a Fulbright scholarship recipient, and she does really interesting work on understanding the role of movement biomechanics and physical activity and musculoskeletal health with an emphasis on NEOA. She utilizes motion capture, wearable sensors and machine learning, which she'll talk with us about today. So take it away, Kerry. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here today. And thank you, Amanda, for the introduction and the invite to come talk to all of you. I'm going to talk today a little bit about some of the work we've been doing in trying to understand how we might be able to scale up some of the current biomechanics data collection that's being done to better understand osteoarthritis, with a focus on a couple of our ongoing research projects, but still trying to understand what that core mechanical role is in the osteoarthritis. So I think there's pretty good evidence from the literature that mechanical loading does influence tissue changes and disease progression, as well as symptoms such as pain and functional decline in osteoarthritis, which is a leading cause of disability, and it has no cure. And so it seems that should be, at least from a biomechanics perspective, a highly actionable pathway to address abnormal biomechanical loading in order to slow some of these detrimental changes that we see with our patients. Despite this, translation has been relatively mixed. And so biomechanics and exercise-based interventions have shown variable effects. They're often modest or inconsistent, or they don't last very long. And just to show you a few quotes from some relatively recent reviews and other papers, the evidence did not bring forward indisputable evidence for nor against the causal relationship between exercise and improved NEOA pain. Evidence demonstrates that exercise therapy is superior to placebo in the short term, but the certainty of this evidence is low to very low. And although biomechanical interventions are arguably relatively inexpensive, non-invasive, and have limited known side effects, their effectiveness remains unclear, and systematic reviews and clinical practice guidelines provide limited support for their widespread use. And so this really brings up the question of why haven't these biomechanical findings translated more strongly into interventions? So we think that this is really due to a few key barriers, in particular that because of the way biomechanics data are currently collected, we often end up with relatively small samples. These are collected in controlled lab settings, and so they don't necessarily represent the whole population of individuals with osteoarthritis very well. And they also poorly capture, in some ways, what people are doing out in the real world. So what is the real world movement or loading that they're experiencing in their day-to-day life? So this is really a measurement problem. And we need to think about whether we're capturing the right biomechanics. Are we capturing them in enough people? Are we capturing them in the right context? And so what I want to talk to you today about is a couple of strategies that we're working on to rethink how we can measure biomechanics and be able to scale this up and try to address some of these current limitations. The first one is a study where we try to take the lab to the community to be able to increase our sample size and expand access while still getting these really rigorous lab-like measurements of biomechanics. And we also try to capture a range of activities of daily living to expand beyond just that one activity that we commonly collect in biomechanics, which is walking. The second strategy, which, as Amanda mentioned, involves wearable sensors, is that we try to capture real-world movement with wearable sensors and then integrate that with some of our really controlled gait biomechanics data from a lab or clinical setting using machine learning. And then some of our more recent work with this has been exploring different types of biomechanical inputs. And so I'm going to talk about these as two sort of complementary strategies as to how we could rethink measurement of biomechanics to be able to scale it up and address some of these limitations. So for this first one, which is our shared stride study, this was led by two of my graduate students, Jenna Qualter and Ryan McCluskey. The motivation, as I mentioned, because we have this limited sample size and this issue with representativeness in our current approaches in traditional biomechanics, where we're often constrained to the lab, because we're often using marker-based biomechanics, we need very skilled researchers and people who are going to be able to take the time to come to the lab, wear very tight-fitting clothing, be there for a few hours while we place markers in very specific anatomical locations. And so this is kind of slow and kind of limits who can participate. And so our approach for this study was to use markerless or video-based motion capture for those who may be unfamiliar, which reduces data collection time because it uses just these videos and then applies machine learning within a software to be able to calculate joint angles and all of the same information you would be able to get out of the traditional marker-based motion capture data. And this could potentially improve participant comfort during participation because they also can just wear their own clothing. There's been a few studies looking at reliability and validity with different types of clothing and over time. And this is a newer technology. Some people are not quite comfortable with this yet in the biomechanics community, but we may be able to accept a little bit of noise in the system if we're able to scale it up and have these larger samples of participants. And then second, in order to try to increase accessibility and potentially increase representativeness of our samples, we wanted to take the data collection to community sites. This has been shown in other fields to be able to increase participation, particularly in older adults, which is important for osteoarthritis, as well as in other underrepresented groups within research. And so for this study, we held data collection events at 4 different sites around Gainesville, Florida, which are near the UF campus, University of Florida campus, which is shown in green in the little map on the bottom left there. These included a non-residential, so just day use, senior recreation center, which was located in the community in the north part of town. Our residential senior living community, so this is a retirement community that's affiliated with the University of Florida that's just a little bit south of campus. We also had a location in a laboratory that was in our orthopedic and sports medicine building. It's actually right behind the physical therapy clinic there. That's right on the edge of the campus. And then we also had a site that was in one of the meeting rooms in the student union, which is a little bit more centrally located in the campus. We had participants arriving about every 20 minutes. They could either be pre-screened over the phone and schedule an appointment for a specific location and date and time, or they could walk in and be screened on site and choose to participate either that day if we had availability or to schedule to participate on a different date. When they arrive, they would go through the informed consent process. If there was no one using the motion capture equipment at the time, we would send them to biomechanics data collection first and then have them do questionnaires afterwards. Or if we already had somebody having their biomechanics collected, they might do questionnaires first and then go to biomechanics. And this allowed us to have multiple people participating at the same time. So this was designed as a high throughput study where we could have somebody doing consent, somebody else doing biomechanics, and then maybe 1 or 2 other people doing questionnaires at the same time. And we brought a large team of students to help do all of these data collections. We would usually run them from about 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. at the sites that we went to, depending on the site availability. So this was technically a pilot study that was funded through the Pepper Center here at UF. And so one of the things we were interested in learning more about was feasibility. So could we do this? Would we be able to recruit more people? And we ended up enrolling 85 participants across 12 of these data collection events or dates. We had 18 participants maximum that we collected within 1 day, which was pretty good compared to what you usually do in a lab where you might have 2 people per day if you had a pretty busy day in your lab. You may notice that this also does not equal 85 divided by 12. This was mostly due to scheduling. People were allowed to choose the site they wanted to go to. The community sites did end up having higher attendance. We had a few days where, for example, at the student union, we only had 2 people scheduled that day. So we could get up to 18 participants. And we actually had enough slots within our day that we probably could have done about 22 participants if we had fully filled our schedule. Across everybody who participated, this averaged out to about 60 minutes on site per participant. But as I said, we would have participants overlap so that we had about 3 or so there at a time. We did have some logistical challenges related to this high throughput approach. This required a very large team, a few of whom you see in these pictures on the right here, loading our equipment into the trucks that, luckily being in a mechanical and aerospace engineering department, we were able to have access to a liftgate truck that we could borrow for these data collections to transport our equipment. But this required a large team. We actually had about 30 students that would take shifts in between their classes to come over and help. It seemed to work best, especially when we had about 4 participants on site at a time and other people kind of walking in and asking, oh, what's going on here? Having about 6 people on site at a time at police. We then also had some challenges that we learned how to deal with in terms of managing participant arrivals. So sometimes people would arrive late, sometimes they'd arrive early. Sometimes we'd have no-shows or cancellations. And then, as I said, we had people that also could walk in and be screened on site. Both of our community locations were located off of public hallways. And so people might walk by and look in. And I think they were very excited about our very colorful cones that we had all around to prevent people from tripping on the wires. And so they'd often poke their heads in and say, oh, what's going on in here? This is interesting, and ask us about what we were doing. The 2 community sites in particular also have a lot of really exciting and popular programs like yoga, woodworking, Zumba, all kinds of things going on. And so trying to schedule the specific dates at the community sites was a little bit of a challenge. And then last, because we had this high throughput model, it was a little bit more stressful to deal with any software support issues that we had, particularly because Vicon, who's our motion company software provider, was on Mountain Standard Time. So they're out in Colorado. And so sometimes if we were having trouble getting the system calibrated at a new place and we had 3 participants arriving within the next hour, it started to get a little bit stressful and we had to do some quick problem solving on the fly to not have to rearrange 3 participants. It's a lot easier when you're in the lab and you're having some technical issues and you can just schedule one person for a little bit later in the day or a different day versus having to schedule a whole day's worth of up to 18 participants. Our other question that we were really interested in, though, was learning about who we were recruiting to the study, who was enrolling in the study. As you can see our flow chart on the right there of the people that we screened, they're separated into screened via phone and screened on site as walk-ins. A few of the things that we were really excited to see and thought was an improvement over some of the traditional methods for doing biomechanics research was that we had about 25% of our sample that were first-time research participants. 16 of these participated at our community sites. We also had 24% who walked in and participated. These were all at the community sites and included 11 of those individuals who were new research participants as well. And so this amounted to 40% of our total sample of 85 participants who enrolled in our study. As you can see, looking at the flow chart, the number who were eligible for the walk-in participants versus who enrolled was quite high, perhaps because they could participate immediately in most cases that same day, whereas the number that were eligible versus enrolled for the people that were screened via phone was a bit lower, but still reasonable for most biomechanics studies. We also had 58% of our sample overall that reported the choice, having that choice of location affected their ability to participate. And this was even a little bit higher at the community sites, I think in part likely because of these walk-ins who, because they just happened to be there today and were just hanging out looking for things to do, especially at the senior center, were able to just walk in and participate immediately. There were a few things that didn't change. We were hoping that by going out to some of these community sites, we may see some differences in terms of the demographics of the participants that we recruited. However, as with most research studies, we still ended up with a group that was primarily highly educated, primarily white, and had moderate osteoarthritis according to their KOOS scores. We did see a little bit of a wider range in terms of income and education levels. especially at our community sites, as well as transportation types, including public transit, walking, and being Florida, one person who used a golf cart to get to the data collection. At our community sites, this was not significantly different among the sites, but we only had a few different dates within our sites. And so this might change if we had slightly different sites or if we expanded that a little bit further. So some improvements in terms of who participated, but also some things that didn't improve yet. So I think this leads to a few main takeaways in terms of the methodological insights. First, scaling biomechanics is not just a technical problem. In this case, this really shows that this is a bit of a sampling problem as well. The recruitment strategy is going to matter. The location is going to matter, and who is going to show up is not always representative of everybody who is affected. And so I think this also leads to a few of the remaining challenges that we might want to address and that my group is going to try to work towards addressing as we move forward, which includes refining some of our recruitment strategies, as well as the specific sites, such as through partnerships with community organizations that have ties to some underrepresented populations within our OA biomechanics population of interest. The sites that we chose, as I said, for example, the retirement center that we chose, the retirement community, is affiliated with the University of Florida. And so there are many individuals who retire and live there who were former university professors. And so the demographics of the individuals recruited at that site are actually not that different than what you might expect from the University of Florida itself. And so if we wanted to have a slightly more diverse population that was a bit more representative of the larger population of individuals with osteoarthritis, we likely need to reach out a little bit further beyond these sites that were pretty close to the university. We knew that that was just partially because of the feasibility aspect to see if we could do this first before we ventured further afield. We also did capture a full set of activities of daily living, including walking at a couple different speeds, some balance tests, standing up from a chair, squatting, stepping up and down from a step stool. And so we had a broader range of activities that people might do in this more familiar setting of these community environments, but we still didn't really capture how people move in daily life. And so most of you probably do more than just that set of 8 different things in your daily life. All of those different things that you do could affect the loading on your joints. And so this leads into our second strategy, where we wanted to think about real world data and how we might be able to incorporate some of that alongside some of these other studies. So the lab really doesn't specifically reflect daily life. Wearable sensors can provide continuous data, but they can be a bit hard to interpret mechanically what's going on, especially if they're worn at the wrist or the low back versus getting that knee-specific measures. They are potentially distinct from what we're measuring in the lab because they are measuring something different, but it's unclear whether there is some overlap in terms of how people move within the lab relative to how they move in the real world. And then one last challenge that we recently published an editorial about was that these are often reduced to summary measures like step count. So this can be a challenge if we're thinking about movement from the point of view of joint loading. And so while you could have 2 different people that did 6,000 steps within a day, if one person did that because they played basketball for an hour and then they sat down on their couch the rest of the day, that's a very different loading pattern than somebody else who spent all day wandering around a museum, slowly taking in all of the art that they're looking at. And so my student, Peter Schaefer, who's a PhD student here, has helped with a lot of these studies that we've been working on using data from the multi-center osteoarthritis study, where we're trying to integrate some of these lab-like, very detailed measures of biomechanics alongside some of these wearable measures of real-world data within a larger cohort. And we've been using machine learning to try to identify some of these patterns and how they might be related to disease progression. And in particular, what I'm going to talk about today was a study that is actually a sneak peek of what Peter will be presenting at ORSI this year, where we were exploring different input feature sets and thinking about how different types of the data and different ways of capturing data, not just with these summary measures or discrete measures, might affect whether we're making a better prediction of who's going to get worse or not. This was based on a paper that we published previously where we predicted cartilage worsening in the most data set using ground reaction force data, wearable data, clinical measures, as well as demographic measures using an ensemble machine learning approach. And so we took a set of candidate learners, which you can see at the very bottom here, a list of them. So these are machine learning approaches that use different learning strategies. We trained each one of those using cross-validation, combine those together using a weighted combination of their predictions to come up with a final predicted outcome, evaluate that on our held out test set, and then we repeat this 100 different times to get an idea of how robust that prediction is. And within this data set, we had a median area under our receiver operating characteristic curve of 0.73. And you can see the range there across 100 iterations. And this was relatively comparable to other machine learning models in osteoarthritis that were looking at structural progression. And we took that one step further by then trying to identify potentially relevant predictors using G computation to think about causal inference methods here and not just associations. And we came up with this set of a few somewhat random, obviously statistically relevant, but a little bit odd predictors, which included the lateral ground reaction force impulse, time spent lying, and then the unloading rate for the vertical ground reaction force. So this was a good start to show that we could use machine learning to compare this multimodal set of data inputs. But I think there's still some more things we wanted to figure out with this, given these predictors in particular and trying to interpret what they mean. And so previously, we looked at extracted features from the ground reaction force data. You can see this on the right here. So these three plots here are our three sets of one line per person within the data set, ground reaction forces, so vertical ground reaction force on the top, anterior posterior in the middle, and then medial lateral on the bottom. And this is the force that's applied back onto the foot as the person steps on the ground. And you can see the little red arrow along the top as the person's applying their foot to the ground. This is the force that's being applied back to them. And these are just normalized to that foot contact time. So these were mostly features like the peak or the impulse area under the curve, some of the loading rates or unloading rates, as I said. And then we did something very similar with our wearable measures where we had some summary features like step count or that percent time lying. And we thought these are time varying signals. So these might not actually fully represent that dynamic loading that the joint is exposed to and the tissues are responding to. And so we wanted to explore this a little bit further by coming up with some new input features that we could put into this machine learning model. And we did this by thinking about these in two different ways. Within our gait data, we applied principal component analysis to be able to extract some of these patterns of variation and not just the peaks or other discrete measures. And then within our physical activity data, because some of the human activity recognition field has had success in identifying different activities people are doing by looking at what we term signal processing features. So these are both time domain and frequency domain features that are really just categorizing what that signal looks like. We decided to try to extract some of those from the accelerometer data in most and look at repeating this super learner training using these different sets of features. So the baseline is just the clinical and demographic features. Feature set one is essentially a repeat of what we did in our prior study. And then feature sets 2 through 3 are using that slightly more complex or more detailed information from either the signal processing data from the accelerometer, signal processing features that we extracted from the accelerometer, the principal component analysis features, or PC scores, that we extracted from our ground reaction force data, or both in feature set 4. We ran these on the same exact data splits. Across each of these feature sets, we used the same data splits, ran the superlearner model. And what we found was, unfortunately, none of these actually improved our performance. So contrary to our expectations, whether we were using an outcome measure of cartilage worsening, which you can see in the first column there, this is medial tibiofemoral cartilage worsening, bone marrow lesion worsening over that same 2-year period, or either cartilage or bone marrow lesion worsening, any of these feature sets pretty much gave almost exactly the same predictive performance. And so there's a few potential implications here. One, this could just mean that there really is a limited impact of biomechanics and physical activity data. However, there are a few other options that might be better for me and for having a career in this field for a little bit longer, which is that the ground reaction forces that we used here are really just representing limb loading. They're not necessarily getting at the knee specific loading, or in particular, medial compartment loading, whereas things like the knee adduction moment has been posed previously as a surrogate measure of medial compartment loading relative to lateral compartment loading. And so perhaps by using this sort of simplified measure of gait biomechanics, we don't have as detailed of a measure of gait biomechanics as we might get from if we had full lab data, or data like we had in our first study, where we're using the markerless motion capture in community settings. We did try to remove highly correlated variables by using domain knowledge to do some feature selection prior to putting these different feature sets into our models. And our models do take care of some of the correlation among the input features, but the way that they do it is that, for example, if we had a gait feature that was highly correlated with body mass index, depending on the specific data split, it might choose body mass index as an important predictor for one data split, and then the subsequent data split, just because the people in it are slightly a bit different when they're training the data, then it might choose that gait feature instead and say that loading, which is related to body mass index, in this one is the more important one. And so body mass index might not be an important predictor. And so there may be some more feature engineering we could do to look at these kind of sets of related either demographic with loading features or movement features that kind of get at both how much people are doing in terms of their physical activity and real world data, as well as the specific loading they're doing in the lab. And then the last thing is, in most, we only have accelerometer data from 1 week of data. This has been shown to give reliable measures for things like step count or minutes in moderate to vigorous physical activity. But for some of these newer features, where we're looking at some of the frequency measures, or we're trying to understand things like skewness or kurtosis of our data, we may want to think about whether we need longer wearable monitoring to really capture that variety of activity that people are doing in the real world. And so scaling biomechanics does introduce some new methodological questions. In summary here, we're hoping to move towards larger and more representative samples. It does appear that it is possible to take data collection to the community. I don't know if I explicitly said this, but we did not see differences across our 4 sites in terms of the feasibility numbers. So the time it took us to get set up at each site, the length of time it took for us to do the data collections on the participants that were there at those sites. And then the recruitment strategies and sites, however, are going to require some further consideration if we do really want to have these more representative samples. So we were able to recruit some first-time participants. We were able to take walk-ins who might have not participated otherwise, but we still are lacking a bit in terms of representing the demographics of that larger population of individuals with knee osteoarthritis. Thinking about what the important part of the signal or signals is something that still needs further consideration, and is something that we're actively working on and trying to understand these relationships between what we collect within the lab and what we're collecting outside of the lab with wearable sensors. Are there other things that we should be extracting from the signals that we have, such as these metrics that I showed in the second approach here. And thinking about what data do we want? So how much noise can we accept if we're going to have these larger samples, if we're going to have real world data? We might not be able to get x-rays on 2,000, 4,000, 5,000 people, but we might be able to have wearable sensor data on them and questionnaire data that they fill out to look at progression. With this real world data, people are doing a whole variety of different things. We may have to deal with some sensor issues like drift. And while there are some approaches to do that, we're going to have to think about, is that okay? Do we need to collect full gate data in the real world? Is it okay to just have wearable sensor data? Is it okay to have things like ground reaction forces versus the adduction moment? And so I think there's a lot more methodological things we could look into here as we think about scaling up biomechanics data for knee osteoarthritis. And so my takeaway is, if we want biomechanics to translate, we need to rethink not just what we measure, but how and where we measure it and how we use the data. And so, as I said, this took a large team to be able to do all of this work. There's just a few of them here in this picture, not everybody. So I'd like to thank all the students in my lab, as well as all of our research participants and the community sites with whom we would not be able to do this research, our funding sources, and I'm happy to take any questions at this time.
Wait for everybody to put in their emojis here. And feel free to type questions in the chat or just unmute and ask them whatever you can or wish to do. Guess while we're waiting, I feel like reviewers are very harsh on markerless motion capture in a variety of settings. And I wonder how, like, it makes perfect sense to me, but I'm not a biomechanist, like how you sort of argue, well, yeah, but we can take it to the people and get a more representative sample without getting that like massive pushback that this isn't the gold standard way of doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's been more and more research coming out in terms of validation studies, comparing it to marker-based motion capture during different activities, including a few recently that have been in osteoarthritis specifically. So most of the original ones were just in walking, just in healthy individuals, which is a good start. But yeah, I think there are going to be some people that are always going to be, you know, I'm only sticking with marker-based, which is totally fine. For us, I think, in my opinion, scaling it up is going to be more important. I think there's a benefit to both of those, but I think scaling it up is going to be more important, and I'm willing to accept that little bit of noise that we may get. Keeping in mind also that marker-based has its own issues with marker placement and soft tissue artifact and things like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm willing to accept a little bit of noise there.
Agree. See, we have one in the chat from Carla Hill. Do you have any experience with inside shoe inserts, load sole? Curious how that may compare to markerless motion capture for accuracy and feasibility.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have not used those myself, but it is something that you could use. I didn't actually mention this here, but we did, and you might not be able to see it. I'll go back to the pictures. I don't know if you really are going to be able to see it very well, but we actually brought force plates with us. So this sort of gray walkway in the middle actually has a couple of AMTI force plates in there so that we could still get joint loading or be able to measure joint loading. You could, in theory, do that with the insole based measurements as well. I think many of those record pressure rather than load themselves. And so you would only be able to get vertical ground reaction force and not the three-dimensional one.
Richard?
Hey, Kerry, thank you for your talk. I liked it a lot. I'm wondering, if this association between biomechanics and OA progression, BMLs, cartilage lesions, and so on. If it's difficult to see a really strong association, maybe that's telling us that it's not just biomechanics itself and that there's other things that are important. I see, your plans for optimizing this, getting larger sample sizes and so on, but at some point, maybe there's something to do with the biology plus the biomechanics that are interacting with each other. I think most of us think that's the case, but teasing that out is going to be difficult unless you have additional data to the biomechanics data. So I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's essentially why we want to scale up the biomechanics, is that there may be a combination of all of these other risk factors with biomechanics. And if we're not able to, account for all of those because our biomechanics samples are so small and so homogeneous, I think that might be why we get these really strong results in these biomechanics studies that are very narrow. But then once we go to try to translate those, and now we have maybe a wider population where we didn't think about, who might respond to the specific treatment based on all of their other risk factors, that might be part of the issue that we're experiencing here. And then, as I said, I think the other issue is that we're capturing all these in a lab setting, and then people go out and live their normal daily lives. And, the lab is great for getting that, mechanistic insight. And then I think in order to translate that into an intervention that might be more effective and more long-term, that we're going to need to really understand more about what people are doing during the real world daily life in the context of all of these other risk factors.
Thanks.
Give people just a minute in case they're gathering thoughts. I'm in the chat right now.
And I kept this relatively high level, because I wasn't sure who exactly was going to be in the audience, but I'm happy to answer more specifics about any of these methods too, if anybody has any more broad questions.
It's just so clear and everybody gets it. All right. Well, I appreciate your work in trying to bring this to a broader crew. I think that's really valuable, and then that'll allow you to get some of these other bits of data. So I look forward to seeing where this goes in the future. And thanks so much for talking with us today.
Yeah, thank you.